This is Upstate's HealthLink on Air. Linda Cohen here with you. For most adults and adolescents in the U.S., caffeine is part of everyday life. And while we tend to associate caffeine with certain beverages, it's also commonly found in many of our foods and medicines as well. But most of us don't think of caffeine as a drug, and certainly not a dangerous one. Until now. Meet powdered caffeine. Joining us with more on this is Dr. William Eggleston. He's a pharmacist and fellow in clinical toxicology at Upstate Medical University and with the Upstate New York Poison Center. Welcome, Dr. Eggleston. Thanks for coming in. So, caffeine now comes in powdered form. What is it? Explain that.
So, caffeine's always existed in powdered form. It's brought in bulk from various different countries, and typically it's used by the soft drink industry, by the coffee industry, as a supplement to their beverages. But recently it's become available direct to consumer. So I can go online and I can buy the same pure caffeine powder that places like Coke and Pepsi have been using to add to their beverages for years and years.
So what's the problem with this? Why is it a problem?
So this is 100% pure caffeine. It's not something that's diluted, it's not something that's mixed, it's straight caffeine. And so we typically think of caffeine as being something part of our everyday lives. It's something we use to get up in the morning. It's something we take maybe in a medicine when we have a headache. But this is, because this is such a high amount in a small volume, you can get into trouble pretty quickly if you misuse it.
I read somewhere that 1 teaspoon of this powdered caffeine is as powerful as drinking 25 cups of caffeinated coffee.
Yeah, that's correct. 1 teaspoon is about 25 cups. And if you go online, it's available in various sizes, and depending on how much you buy, you get your price. And so I looked this morning, and I can get a 100-gram bag for about $5 to $10 at the moment. Wow. And that bag is equivalent to about 560 medium-sized Dunkin' Donuts coffees.
Wow.
So for $9, I can have my caffeine for over a year.
My goodness, that's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So remind us right now what caffeine actually does to the body.
Absolutely. So caffeine it's kind of like, if you think about when a car goes and you hit on the gas and the car takes off, but then if you're going too fast, you can hit on the brakes and slow down. Our body has the same type of system. We have stimulant chemicals like norepinephrine, to get technical. And then when you have too much of that, your body has another chemical called adenosine. That's the brake. It comes in and says, whoa, we're going too fast, let's slow down. And so what caffeine does is it gets in the way. It stops that adenosine. It takes away the brake. So your body gets an overdrive of stimulatory chemicals without its normal way to stop them.
Wow. And what are some of the symptoms? In other words, increased heart rate, sometimes an uneven heart rhythm. What are the kinds of things that it does? What do you experience?
So it's a bit of a spectrum. If you think about, maybe you haven't had coffee for a week, and now this morning you've got a big test, so you drink 3 cups. And you might feel a little sick to your stomach, and maybe your hands are shaking a little bit. And that's kind of the low end of what it does. And as you move forward and you push up the doses, your heart rate increases. And as your heart rate increases, you can have abnormal heartbeats, which are what we call arrhythmias, and that can lead to fatalities. And then you can also have, because it penetrates the brain so well, toxicity up there from all the stimulation. So you can see things like seizures, hallucinations, agitation. So with tremor and nausea and vomiting being kind of on the low end, and as you push forward, arrhythmias and seizures on the high end.
And clearly things like difficulty sleeping, sometimes even tremors that go along
Absolutely,
with that.
Yeah. And there's withdrawal associated with it as well. So caffeine, when you use too much of it, can definitely be a detrimental thing.
So is it addictive? Actually addictive?
It can be, yes. If you think about when you don't have your morning coffee, if you drink it every day, there is an actual withdrawal associated with caffeine. So you might get a little bit irritable, you might get a little bit agitated, maybe a little shaky, a headache, and then you take your coffee and you feel better. So caffeine in and of itself can be addictive.
It's so interesting because, as you said earlier, most of us think about using caffeine in a fairly kind of benign way. I mean, we all grow up knowing that if you drink coffee, you seem more alert, kind of thing. Or as you said, you might take it in a medicine like an Excedrin or something of that nature because you have a headache.
It's very ubiquitous, which is what makes this drug so scary. So caffeine is probably one of the most unique supplements in the entire country because it exists as a supplement in powder form, in tablet form that you can buy as a health supplement. It exists as a food within soda and coffee. And so there's different bodies that regulate those two areas. And then it also exists in drug form. So it exists in things like NoDoz and Excedrin as over-the-counter drugs. And then it's a prescription drug as well that we use in the hospital. So it runs the gamut from supplement all the way down to regulated medicine. But there's no one body that governs all of those.
So the FDA really, at this point, doesn't have any control over this current offering.
Correct. Because it is marketed as a supplement, the FDA does not have the authority to step in and just say, we're going to pull this from the shelves. It's dangerous.
What's interesting to me, though, is I never known that it was being produced as in powdered form in such large quantity. And what you helped me understand now is that it's been used for many, many, many years as the way to inject it into or add it into those beverages that are common everyday Coke and Pepsi.
Exactly. It's very, very cheap when you buy it in bulk, and so it's always existed in that market. But in recent years, it's become direct to consumer, and now we're running into some of these issues with folks dosing their own pure caffeine.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Upstate's HealthLink on Air. I'm Linda Cohen here with pharmacist William Eggleston, and from the Upstate New York Poison Center, we're talking about the dangers of powdered caffeine. So I guess my biggest concern here is what actual dangers? You mentioned that if you have too much, you can go, it's kind of like there's a spectrum of symptoms. What happens with a true overdose with caffeine?
So in true overdose, it's tough to say when you're going to start to see things like vomiting, like seizures, like arrhythmias, because like any other drug, there's tolerance. So if you drink 3 cups of coffee a day, and then you've got a friend that never touches the stuff, and all of a sudden your friend uses the powder, they're going to be more sensitive. But we do know what a lethal dose is. We know that a lethal dose for your average American female, or 150-pound female, is about 3.5 teaspoons, which is right around 10,000 milligrams. And then your average American male, who's about 180 pounds, is going to take them about 12,000 milligrams, or 4 teaspoons of this powder. And those doses we know to be lethal.
And lethal leading to something like an arrhythmia and therefore heart. And there have been.
Correct. Yeah, they'll either have an arrhythmia or a seizure. And there have been deaths. There was a death in Ohio back last summer, an 18-year-old high school student, and then there was another male in his 20s down in Georgia. And both of them, just based on speaking with family members and friends, it was determined that they weren't abusing it. They were trying to be health conscious, and they said, if I put my caffeine in my water, it's better for me than my Mountain Dew.
Wow.
And so it was just accidental misuse that led to death.
And that's what the scary part is, as you mentioned, because it sounds to me like little differences in this powdered material can move you from a safe dose to an unsafe dose.
Absolutely. Someone who is unfamiliar with properly dosing caffeine and who maybe hasn't read the literature would maybe dose it just like their protein powder. So a lot of kids using this are using it for weightlifting and enhancement from that area. And so if you use a scoop of protein powder, why not use a scoop of caffeine too?
That's
and
frightening.
As we talked about earlier, just a tablespoon is really enough to kill your average size adult.
Wow. So when did this start becoming available? I mean, you said there was a death last summer, so when did this all start to happen, to be made available to the everyday person?
So it looks like it came on the market sometime late 2013, early 2014, but no one really heard about it, as with most dangerous supplements, until there was a death. And once there was a death, we all became acutely aware of it, and there's been many advocacy groups, the American Association of Poison Centers, as well as the Council for Responsible Nutrition, who is a trade group with a lot of the supplement organizations, and they have urged their members to not market these products.
So what can really be done? I mean, let's start from a legislative perspective or from a legal perspective. What can they do? I mean, the FDA has no jurisdiction here.
As of right now, the FDA has not been able to step in and do anything on a national level. They are continuing to advise against use. They're considering all of their legal options, but as of yet, they have not been able to come in and say this product is not able to be sold. A couple of senators from Connecticut and Ohio have petitioned the FDA back in the late winter to remove the products, but nothing has come of that as of yet. There are local legislators. Suffolk County has prohibited sales to minors.
Oh, they have?
Yes, and there are a few states. Ohio introduced a bill to ban powdered caffeine, as well as there's legislation in process in New York and New Jersey. So there are states that are taking action on their local and state levels to try and regulate the product.
But if it's being bought through the internet, how do they play any role? It seems to me. I mean,
that's where it gets difficult. So they can take it off the shelves and not be able to have
walk into a
some of
store
the access
somewhere
that they would have before. Exactly. So you can't walk down to a corner store and buy it, but like you said, you can still go online and buy it all you want, and so that makes it very difficult from a legislative perspective.
I mean, is there the thought that, is there any hope that there will be, based on these legislative initiatives, that there will be a larger scale effort or even a federal effort to actually ban them?
So from what we can tell now, folks familiar with the FDA and their processes say that they don't anticipate any sweeping legislation in the next year to pull these products from the shelves. It's very muddy water, because then where do you come through and say, your coffee can only contain this much and your soda can only contain this much. So regulation of caffeine is a tricky thing because it is so ubiquitous in our society.
Are there other drugs that fit that profile? It strikes me as that's a very, very unique set of circumstances.
To my knowledge, there are no other drugs to fit that profile that are regulated in such murky ways. We have it on, as I had said, a prescription drug level, an over-the-counter drug level, a food level, and then a supplement level. So all different regulations apply to each one of those different areas.
So it's going to take a unique set of legislation or a unique act somehow to change this, and it would be sad to think that we'd have to lose more young people as a result of that.
Absolutely. It's going to take some very clever legislation to remove these products from the shelves.
Well, in lieu of that, in place of that, what can people do? What do you recommend, or what are, as part of the New York State poison control, Upstate poison control, what do you recommend people do?
So
parents, concerned adults,
absolutely.
What have you?
I think this needs to be a conversation that's had between parents and their children and amongst friends. And these are products where we really cannot, we're in line with the FDA, you can't advocate these use. They should not be available direct to consumer. You need a lab grade scale, one of those scales you used back in chemistry, in order to accurately dose these products.
So a kitchen teaspoon, for example,
will never be able to accurately dose these products. The advised dose is about a 1/16 of a teaspoon. So I would challenge someone to go home and try and measure out a 1/16 of a teaspoon and see how close you get. And it's not something that's easily done.
So basically what you're advocating is for parents or concerned adults, if they sense that this is happening in their environment, to put a stop to it.
I would say so, yes. The big concern is there's always going to be people who want to misuse substances, and that's the reality of what we deal with. But it's not that's not the major concern here. The major concern is accidental misuse. Things like no-dose tablets that are caffeine tablets. You have to take 16 of those to equal about a teaspoon of this powder. So someone's not going to accidentally take 16 tablets, but someone may accidentally take a teaspoon of powder.
Well, it's very, very, very frightening. So clearly people, parents, concerned adults, and unfortunately it's young adults who become most involved in this kind of thing because they do. We know this from every other type of drug.
It's the perfect market. It's marketed to health-conscious, athletic individuals who are burning the candle at both ends.
And what happens if you believe that you're having some kind of a caffeine overdose? What do you recommend? What's the important thing to know?
So, especially with these powders, you can see toxic effects in as little as 30 minutes. So if you think that you have misused or misdosed this, I would advise seeking medical attention through emergency resources immediately and getting to a hospital to be evaluated. In the interim, if there's folks who have questions about these, they can always contact the New York Poison Center, the
Upstate or other poison centers.
Yes, or any poison center at 1-800-222-1222.
Very good.
And they'll be happy to help with any questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming in. This is very important information for people to know about, and it's a very scary thing. You could almost sprinkle it on your food inadvertently, have no idea of the amount, and really put yourself at risk.
Absolutely.
My guest has been Dr. William Eggleston. He's a pharmacist and fellow in clinical toxicology at Upstate Medical University, and he's with the Upstate New York Poison Center as well. Thanks so much for coming in.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
I'm Linda Cohen, and you're listening to Upstate's HealthLink on Air.